Welcome back to the fifth and final episode in the Amati violin restoration. Just start here by removing the clamps that have been on overnight while the top plate glue dried. I generally leave the glue overnight to dry and harden fully. You can leave it for a shorter period of time, but for a large piece like a top plate or a fingerboard going on, for instance, I think I would leave it on overnight to err on the safe side. These clamps, as you take them off, I'm just undoing one end of them, but then you need to sort of snap the sometimes the one end of the clamp gets a bit jammed on the thread. They need a bit of a sort of clip off, but come off, and we'll put those away. Just a quick inspection of the join all the way around. Come in now with some varnish preparation, a little bit of ground and some of the early varnish. I'm just going through here and testing the colours in different areas. There's quite a few different variations of colours coming through on this plate, and so I'm just at the early initial stages of working a little ground colour into the open crack areas and seeing how it looks. The ground is a powdered pigment, artist's pigment, which you use to build up the colour and build up layers of colour. It's quite a detailed process and a process that I'm constantly learning as well. It's one that takes a lot of time and years to really perfect. There's quite a bit of heat damage on the top plate as well, just above that base F-hole on this instrument. There's a sort of a patch around about the size of my thumbnail, I guess, that also required some extensive restoration and repair to ensure it didn't continue to break down. Coming in here with the reamer to clean up the peg holes and get the holes for the new pegs to match the correct taper. There's a specific technique to using the peg reamer. You sort of don't just jam it in there and turn it. It's important to turn it in such a way as you don't end up with a stopping or starting point to the hole, so that the peg turns smoothly without having jumpy sections. Now we start cutting the pegs down in the cutter block that matches the taper of the reamer, and the same thing applies with the pegs when you're cutting them down. It's important to try not to get a start or end point to the cutting process. They just cut down as though similar, I guess, to a pencil sharpener, taking off lovely curls of ebony. It's a little more difficult than a than a pencil sharpener would be though. And here I'm just cutting the end grain at the edge of the two rings that are near the handle of the peg on most pegs. And I just run the knife or twist the peg around on the blade of the knife, and this cuts the end grain so that when you're then cutting the taper on it, it doesn't break out the delicately turned rings at the top of the shaft of the peg. And measuring the distance between the wall of the peg box, outside wall of the peg box, and the turned rings on the shaft of the peg, I set my full-size pegs at 11mm from the end of the peg box wall. Often I'll just set them in slightly over 11mm and then adjust them, give them a final adjustment so that they're all matching perfectly. And that's as much for aesthetic balance as it is for when you go to tune your instrument. It is often a natural thing to feel where the pegs are, and if they're each protruding from the neck of the instrument the same amount, it makes it a more comfortable and easier process to tune. Next job on this one was to plane the fingerboard using my Nelson scraper plane, which protects against any coarse grain or knots that may be in the timber of the fingerboard. Some pieces of ebony are quite twisty grain and hard to work, so the scraper blade being upright on the plane takes scraper cuts and doesn't tear the grain like a traditional block plane would. I also have a piece of leather which I put over the scroll on the instrument when I'm planing. The plane does clear the scroll by a reasonable amount. It looks quite close here in the videos, but it does clear it by a reasonable amount, and I've never actually hit the scroll with the plane, but it's quite a deliberate skill, and part of the skill of planing a fingerboard is to ensure you're doing it in such a way that you don't run through. I also have my finger there, which I would actually hit my finger first before hitting the instrument. And obviously the piece of leather on the top of the instrument as well is protecting the varnished top of an instrument in the unlikely event that the plane slips off the end of the fingerboard at the beginning of the stroke. You need to be careful as well that the front corner of the plane doesn't sort of clip the top plate of the instrument, so there's a lot of care that needs to be taken when you're doing this job. And as many of you may know, the use of a plane is also a skill in itself, where you apply pressure on each stroke determines significantly how smoothly your cuts are. And we're just looking to remove the high end at both ends of the fingerboard, so there was quite a dip worn into the timber of the fingerboard. Sometimes they warp slightly as well. So to plane them board flat and also adjust the curvature of the fingerboard to allow for ease of playing, and the arch plays a significant role in the tone of the instrument and also the bowing, and string spacings. I have a particular method of finishing the fingerboards off which I've developed over the years. Much experimentation in order to get a nice, smooth and hard surface, as well as a fairly high gloss and shiny sort of surface. Both aids in moving up and down positions on the fingerboard when you're playing. It looks nice, and also is an aid in intonation if the point at which you're pressing the string down onto the fingerboard is clear of any sort of furriness, or if it's a nice, smooth, hard, well-finished surface, then the point at which your finger and the string make contact with the fingerboard can be crisp and prevent unwanted disturbance in the sound production. I use a mix of different oils, drying oils and grain filler to both fill the open pores of the grain from the cut timber and provide a little oil to the cut timber to feed, in essence, feed the timber. And it also provides a nice surface to then really polish, get a high level of polish and shine on the surface of the ebony. I'm not really leaving a sort of film or varnish on the top of the fingerboard. It's more a medium with which to use to polish. I finish off here with a jeweler's rouge, firstly on a leather block and then just on a cotton cloth with quite a bit of elbow grease to polish and finish the fingerboard nicely. As I go here, the level of polish increases, and you'll start to see my hands and other surrounding things start to reflect out of the surface of the fingerboard. It's a very satisfying process to watch it come up. Not putting a lot of downwards pressure on the fingerboard as I'm doing this. Sort of just hold the instrument fairly gently in my left hand, and it's just the brisk friction and builds a little warmth. There's a little warmth that builds up in the process, and that helps, along with the jeweler's rouge, to do a final cut of the timber. It's a very hard timber ebony and polishes up really nicely. Moving on here to fitting a new bridge to the violin. Start by taking a few cuts off the feet to begin the process of fitting them. On to my usual method of rubbing the feet over the sandpaper. And as I've mentioned before, I use a scalpel to do the majority of the scraping work in my workshop, including fitting the cleats to the underside of the top of this instrument. And that's because the scraping blunts the blade quite quickly, so a disposable blade means I'm not constantly destroying the edge on my nice Japanese knife. a few little scrapes of the carbon paper to help get the feet to fit as normal. The movement backwards and forwards of the bridge on the carbon paper is try to make it as minimal as possible. In time to make some fun curls with the chisel as I cut down the excess after having marked the arch of the top of the bridge. Another sort of satisfying thing, watching the curls leap off the end of the chisel blade. Try to cut these down as accurately as possible just with the chisel. It makes the next process of filing the overall arch shape much easier. And one of my favourite tasks in both cutting a bridge, but I would have to say in an instrument setup, is using this little ibex plane to plane down the surface of the bridge. Some people use a large flat chisel to do this, and they'll have a sort of set shape that they will cut each bridge down to. I like to be a little intuitive about the way that I do it. I like to have a nice arch shape to the bridge, not overly flat, and I like to feel what I'm doing as I'm creating the shape for each individual bridge for each instrument, and work and adjust as I'm going. It does look like I'm moving quite quickly, but there's a lot of feeling and adjusting going on as with each stroke of the plane. Now to cut the little V-nicks for each string groove. I start with just a basic but very tiny V-cut. It's possibly about the width of the pencil mark, sometimes smaller than a pencil mark, the pencil lead width. And then clean the string grooves up with a little mouse tail file, round file. Clean up the edges with the sandpaper. And start my little personalisation of each bridge in the way that I like to do it. It's another fun and artistic process within the setup. It's good fun and requires very sharp tools. Take these little kidney wings down to an ultra fine point, both back and front. There's not a lot of work actually on the back of the bridge. You don't shape it at all, it remains flat. You only shape the front of the bridge. So I don't often work on the back, it's only to do the little decorative touches on both the heart and the wings. I also accentuate the little lion there that's just above the ankle of the bridge foot. Just flipping it over, working both sides of these little kidney wings until the final flick of shaving of maple pops off and leaves those coming into a fine point. Thinning down what is the heel of the bridge foot. And moving on to the V nicks for the marks for the string grooves over the nut. This is a new ebony nut that I fit to this instrument, and again taking ultra fine V grooves very accurately out of the nut. Once you cut these, it's very hard to adjust the position. A well-fitted nut won't have enough room in the height to refile it down if you get this wrong. And then I use special gauge of files for each string groove. There's one individual file for each string that matches the gauge of the strings. It's just one of many specialist tools that are needed and used by luthiers to correctly set up an instrument. And this violin had quite an old sheep gut. In the tailpiece. It was a fairly fancy German sort of 1920s style tailpiece. I chose Violino per Astro strings to go on this instrument. I felt that their richness of sound, and they have an excellent balance between being not overly bright but rich and strong, and quite a lovely warm sounding string. I felt matched the instrument well. I fit the strings in the same pattern for every instrument each time, starting with the G string, then over to the E. This both helps balance the bridge and hold the bridge on in a balanced fashion, but it's also just working up the peg box so that you're not having to thread the next string under a previously fitted string. I put a little graphite from a pencil as well on the grooves of both the bridge and the nut to help the strings slide over. And this is fitting the soundpost. So I'll trim the top fitting end of the soundpost first. The angle of this is, I just do it by eye. I've fit many thousands of soundposts, and through over many years have developed the ability to just quite accurately approximate the angle of both top and bottom of the soundpost. And then just I've used the file there through the top hole of the F-hole to estimate the length, and made a mark in line with the front of the end of the grains on the most obvious grain lines on the soundpost. It's quarter sawn spruce, and it's important that the grain of the soundpost is at 90 degrees to the grain of the top plate for sound production. Just getting the angle for the bottom of the soundpost correct here. Generally a slightly steeper angle on the bottom to fit the bottom plate arching. I'll then fit it onto the soundpost fitting tool in line with the pencil line that I drew on the front of the grains earlier. And it just slides in through the widest part of the treble F-hole and is positioned just behind the treble bridge foot. The exact position can be moved slightly farther away or closer to the bridge depending on the type of sound adjustments you're needing to make. You can also go slightly closer to the middle or farther towards the edge of the instrument depending on what you deem necessary to get the instrument playing at its best. And after a few adjustments to the length, it pops in there. I can just move it slightly into the position that I believe will be best to start with, and then I'll give the instrument a play and make any further adjustments from there. And that pretty much concludes the restoration on this instrument. I'll give it a little play and make some final adjustments, but there it is, looking beautiful and shiny and clean. Full setup complete on it, and the cracks all repaired, the arching repaired, ready to go back to its owner. Please like and subscribe for upcoming content. See you soon.